Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. Tonight we're talking about a pill, a specific pill. A pill so powerful it didn't just change individual lives, it emptied entire institutions. We're talking about Thorazine, the little chlorpromazine tablet that, depending on who you ask, either liberated American psychiatry or accidentally released hundreds of thousands of mentally ill people onto the streets with a pat on the back and a prescription that may or may not have been refilled. Not the most cheerful bedtime story, sure, but then again, neither was living in a psychiatric ward in 1952, which we'll get to. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A special, genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, this one's been sitting in the back of my brain ever since, which feels appropriate given the subject matter. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It is always mysteriously 2 a.m. somewhere. And by the way, we're now on Spotify. Link is in the description. You can let me gently haunt your commute. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, get under whatever blanket you've claimed as your personal property, and let's settle in. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what psychiatric hospitals were actually like before anyone had any idea what to do with the human mind? Did the doctors have a plan, or were they mostly winging it and writing things down? What exactly happened to the people inside those wards? Not in the Hollywood way, but in the slow, fluorescent-lit, Tuesday at 11 a.m. way. Did anyone actually get better? Was there a moment in history when someone looked at a patient in a locked ward and thought, I bet a chemical compound could fix this? And how does a drug discovered in a French naval surgery unit in the 1950s end up reshaping American cities, Medicare policy, and the sidewalks of every major metropolis by the 1980s? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1954. You're wearing a paper gown. There is a nurse at the end of a very long hallway. And somewhere in a pharmaceutical lab in New Jersey, someone is about to change absolutely everything. Let's go back before Thorazine, before antipsychotics, before psychiatry was even a word anyone used with confidence. For most of recorded human history, if your mind stopped working the way the people around you expected it to, the explanations on offer were not great. Demon possession was popular for a while. So was moral weakness, divine punishment, an excess of black bile, witchcraft, or simply the unfortunate condition of being the wrong kind of woman in the wrong century. Treatment, such as it was, ranged from prayer to exorcism to tree panning, which, if you're not familiar, is the ancient practice of drilling a hole in someone's skull to let the evil out, and which is, remarkably, one of the older medical procedures we have evidence of. It did not work particularly well, but for thousands of years it was on the table. The ancient Greeks, who were generally ahead of their time on most things and behind their time on a few crucial others, made some interesting early attempts at naturalistic explanations for mental illness. Hippocrates, working in the 5th century before the Common Era, argued that madness was a condition of the brain rather than a punishment from the gods, a position that was genuinely radical for its moment, and also about 2,500 years ahead of anyone being able to do anything useful with it. He attributed mental disturbance to imbalances in the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much black bile, in particular, was thought to cause what we might now recognise as depression, which is why the word melancholia, which comes from the Greek for black bile, described that condition for centuries. The treatment was dietary, herbal, and various. It was also, by modern standards, completely ineffective, but it was at least more dignified than the alternatives. In medieval Europe, the theological explanation reasserted itself with considerable force. Mental illness was understood in religious terms as demonic possession, as divine punishment, as the outward sign of spiritual corruption. This framing had practical consequences for the people it was applied to. Exorcism was a standard response. So was pilgrimage, prayer, and the laying on of hands at the shrines of appropriate saints. Communities dealt with people whose behaviour was too disruptive to ignore, in ways that range from tolerance to violence, depending on the specific behaviour and the specific community. Some individuals who today would receive a psychiatric diagnosis were understood in their own time as mystics, prophets, or visionaries, the line between religious experience and psychotic experience being, at various historical moments, quite difficult to draw. Here is the thing that is worth sitting with for a moment. For most of human history, no one had any idea what was happening inside the minds of people experiencing severe mental illness. Not the doctors, not the priests, not the families, not the communities. The suffering was visible, the cause was invisible, and in the absence of a real explanation, people reached for the explanations that were available: spiritual, moral, humoral, astrological, and tried to do something with them. Sometimes the things they tried were genuinely harmful. Sometimes they were merely useless. Occasionally they stumbled into something that helped, usually by accident, and almost never for the reason they thought. What is almost always true across cultures and centuries is that the person experiencing the mental illness, the person hearing the voices, seeing the visions, unable to organise thought or feeling into anything recognisable, was, above all, frightening to the people around them. And frightening things historically get managed. They get contained. They get explained away or locked away or burned away. The history of mental illness is, in large part, the history of what happens to people whose inner experience becomes too strange for their society to accommodate. And that history is long, complicated, and not particularly pleasant to read, which is perhaps why most of us prefer not to. The good news, and there is good news, eventually, is that the story does not stay here. It moves forward, slowly and with many wrong turns, towards something that at least resembles understanding. But it takes a while, and the detours are significant. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had decided that the correct approach to mental illness was architecture. If you gathered all the people whose behaviour made the community uncomfortable, and placed them together inside a large building with thick walls and a locked gate, the problem was, if not solved, at least contained and out of sight. These were the first asylums, and the word itself, originally meaning sanctuary, rather quickly accumulated a different set of associations. Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, more commonly known as Bedlam, became so notorious for the conditions inside that its name entered the English language as a synonym for chaos. Visitors would sometimes pay a small fee to tour the wards on weekends, observing the patients the way a modern person might visit a zoo, a detail so grim that most history textbooks mention it once, briefly, and then move on. The logic behind asylum construction was, at its core, a logic of classification. The Enlightenment had produced a passion for sorting things into categories: animals, plants, minerals, social types, and people who could not function in ordinary society were a category that needed managing. In France, the Hôpital General, founded in 1656, swept up not only the mentally ill, but the poor, the vagrant, the chronically unemployed, and various other people who represented a social inconvenience, and housed them together in conditions that reflected the ambiguity of the institution's purpose. Was it a hospital, a poorhouse, a prison? The honest answer, then, and for many decades after, was something of all three, and not doing any of them particularly well. What distinguished the early asylums from what came before was scale and systematization. Individual families had always had to make decisions about relatives whose behaviour became unmanageable. Decisions that might involve locking someone in a room, sending them to relatives in a different village, or, in particularly difficult cases, appealing to local authorities. The asylums centralised this decision, made it a public function rather than a private one, and created institutions large enough to house many people at once. This centralisation had real advantages. It concentrated the problem in one place, made it someone else's specific professional responsibility, and created at least the possibility of observing and comparing cases in ways that might generate knowledge. it also had real disadvantages, most of which became apparent very quickly. The conditions in early asylums were, by virtually any standard you might apply, appalling. Patients were chained to walls, they slept on straw, heat in winter was minimal or non-existent, food was inadequate, violence, from staff, from other patients, from the general environment, was common. There was no treatment in any meaningful sense because no one had any treatment to offer. The asylum existed to contain, not to cure, and the physical environment reflected that purpose with depressing fidelity. The patients who entered these institutions were rarely expected to leave them. The reformers who began pushing back against these conditions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, people like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England, argued for something they called moral treatment. The idea that people with mental illness were human beings who responded to humane conditions, structured routine, kindness, and engagement with meaningful activity. Pinel famously struck the chains from patients at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris in 1793, which is a story that has probably been somewhat romanticized in the retelling, but that represented a genuine philosophical shift. Moral treatment did, in fact, produce better outcomes than chaining people to walls. This turned out not to be a particularly high bar. The asylum era established a template that would persist for over 2 centuries. The large institution, the professional staff, the patient population that arrived and rarely departed, and the persistent gap between the stated therapeutic mission and the actual daily experience of the people inside. It is a template that Thorazine would eventually help to dismantle, but the dismantling, as we will see, came with its own complications. America, having inherited the European tradition of putting people with mental illness somewhere out of the way, proceeded to do what America typically does with inherited traditions: scale them up considerably, add bureaucracy, and eventually run out of funding. By the mid-19th century, reformers like Dorothea Dix were documenting the conditions in American poorhouses and jails where mentally ill people were kept, conditions she described in terms that made legislators visibly uncomfortable. Her campaigns led to the construction of state-funded psychiatric hospitals across the country, large campus-style institutions set in the countryside, designed around the then fashionable theory that fresh air, routine, and removal from the stresses of urban life would heal the troubled mind. The theory was not entirely wrong. It was also not entirely right, and the gap between those two positions is where a very large number of people spent a very long time. Dorothea Dix was, by any measure, a remarkable human being. A Massachusetts schoolteacher who spent 2 years teaching a Sunday school class at a Cambridge jail, and was horrified by what she saw. Mentally ill inmates housed alongside criminals, without heat, without adequate clothing, without anything that could be described as care. She turned her horror into a political project. She spent years visiting institutions across the country, documenting what she found in memorial petitions to state legislatures and lobbying with tireless effectiveness for the construction of state hospitals. She succeeded, over the course of several decades, in persuading over 30 states to build or expand psychiatric institutions. She genuinely believed that the hospitals she helped create would cure people. The hospitals, for the most part, did not cure people, but they housed them, and for the people who had been kept in cages in county jails, this was at minimum an improvement. The state hospital system that developed in America through the second half of the 19th century was, in its early years, sometimes genuinely therapeutic in aspiration if not always in outcome. The Kirkbride Plan, developed by Pennsylvania physician Thomas Story Kirkbride in the 1840s, specified an architectural design for psychiatric hospitals that was intended to embody the principles of moral treatment: long rambling buildings with extensive grounds, organized to provide maximum light, air and tranquility, with patients arranged in graduated wards depending on the severity of their condition, allowing those who improve to move toward independence. Many of the state hospitals built in this period followed versions of this plan, and some of them, in their early decades, operated something like the institutions their designers intended. What Kirkbride and his contemporaries did not adequately account for was what happened when the institutions filled up. The hospitals were designed for a particular census, a finite number of patients who would move through the institution, improve under its therapeutic conditions, and eventually return to the community. What actually happened was that patients arrived and remained. The community had no infrastructure to receive them on discharge. Their families, if they had families, were often unable or unwilling to care for them, and so the population of each hospital grew steadily, year by year, until the elegant Kirkbride buildings were crammed with patients far beyond their designed capacity. The staff ratios became impossible to maintain, and the therapeutic vision dissolved into something that looked much more like warehousing. By the first decades of the 20th century, the American state hospital system housed hundreds of thousands of patients in conditions that had regressed toward the baseline of neglect and containment that Dorothea Dix had spent her life campaigning against. The system had grown enormous and expensive and was widely acknowledged by the people who worked in it to be failing. What it was not doing was generating solutions, because the solutions required a kind of knowledge about the brain, about the biology of mental illness, about what was actually happening in the minds of the people it housed, that medicine did not yet possess. The hospitals kept the patients somewhere. They did not know what to do with them once they were there. The problem with building large institutions to house people with serious mental illness is that they tend to fill up, and then they tend to keep filling up, and at some point the humane therapeutic vision that justified their construction becomes functionally impossible to sustain. By the early 20th century, the state hospitals that Dorothea Dix and her contemporaries had championed were operating at 2 and 3 times their intended capacity. Wards designed for 40 patients held 100. Staff-to-patient ratios that would have alarmed anyone who thought about them for more than 30 seconds were accepted as normal because there was no money and no alternative. The countryside retreats had become warehouses, and most of the people inside them were not getting better, partly because there was genuinely very little anyone knew how to do. To understand what overcrowding meant in practice, it helps to try to picture a specific ward. You're in a large room, longer than it is wide, with high ceilings and windows placed too far up the walls to see out of. There are beds, or rather cots, arranged in rows close enough together that there is barely space to pass between them. There are perhaps 80 of them, in a room originally designed for 35. The smell is a compound of unwashed bodies, institutional food, disinfectant, and something underneath that you do not want to identify. The noise is continuous, voices, some conversational, some not, some in languages the staff do not speak, some not quite language in any recognizable sense. You are a nurse on this ward. You are responsible, along with 2 other nurses, for all 80 of the people in this room. You have no medications that meaningfully address psychosis. You have restraints, leather cuffs, seclusion rooms, for the patients who become a danger to themselves or others. You have the seclusion rooms, you have the cuffs, and you have the rest of your shift, which started at 6 in the morning. The staff who worked in these conditions were not, for the most part, monsters. Most of them were people doing an impossible job with inadequate resources, and the institutional cultures that developed were in many ways a rational response to impossible circumstances. Restraint was used not because it was therapeutic, but because it was sometimes the only available tool for managing acute agitation in a room with 80 patients and 3 staff members. Neglect was not always indifference. It was sometimes the arithmetic result of having more patients than it was possible to attend to. The documentation of conditions in state hospitals produced by journalists and reformers in the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s, Albert Deutsch's Exposé, The Shame of the States, published in 1948, is one of the most important, tends to focus appropriately on the conditions themselves. What it sometimes misses is the extent to which those conditions were as demoralizing for the staff as they were damaging for the patients. The financial picture made everything worse. State hospitals were funded by state legislatures that had many competing priorities and a persistent tendency to view psychiatric care as a bottomless drain on the budget. The hospitals operated on per-patient per-day costs that were, by any clinical standard, insufficient to provide anything approaching adequate care. During the Depression years, some state hospitals reduced rations to the point where patients were visibly malnourished. During World War II, conscientious objectors assigned to state hospital work as an alternative to military service produced the reports that most dramatically expose conditions. The civilian public service workers who worked in state hospitals in the early 1940s wrote accounts that, when they eventually reached the public, produced genuine shock and a congressional investigation that changed very little in the short term. By 1950, the system was enormous, expensive, overwhelmed, and recognised by virtually everyone who had looked at it closely as a humanitarian failure. What it was waiting for, though no one knew this yet, was a drug. If you want to understand why Thorazine was greeted with something approaching religious fervour by American psychiatrists in 1954, you have to understand what they had been working with before it arrived. The roster of pre-Thorazine psychiatric treatments reads like a list assembled by someone who understood the general concept of intervention, but not the specific details of the human brain. Hydrotherapy, wrapping patients in wet sheets or immersing them in baths for hours, was standard. Insulin coma therapy, which involved injecting a patient with enough insulin to induce hypoglycemic coma, and was believed, based on very limited evidence, to reset something in the brain, was widely practiced from the 1930s onward. Lobotomy, developed in Portugal and imported to the United States by Walter Freeman, was performed on tens of thousands of patients through the 1940s and 50s, and electroconvulsive therapy, which genuinely did help some patients with certain conditions, was often administered without anesthesia and in ways that bore very little resemblance to how it is used today. Let's start with hydrotherapy, which has the advantage of being among the less harmful of the available options, which is a low bar and not actually a recommendation. The theory behind continuous bath treatment, in which a patient might be immersed in a tub of water at body temperature for hours or days at a time, kept in place by a canvas cover, was that the constant mild sensory input of warm water would have a calming effect on agitated patients. In practice, it sometimes did. It was also boring, disorienting, and not something anyone would choose to undergo voluntarily. The wet sheet pack, wrapping a patient tightly in cold sheets that would warm up against the body over time, was used for similar purposes and had similar results. These were treatments that managed behaviour more than they addressed illness, which placed them in the same category as physical restraint, with additional steps and a faint smell of damp linen. Insulin coma therapy is a harder case, because it was taken seriously by serious clinicians for a longer time, and required a substantially higher level of intervention. Developed by Manfred Sackel in Vienna in the 1930s, it involved injecting patients with enough insulin to drive blood glucose down to the point of coma, then reviving them with glucose, typically 30 to 50 times over a course of treatment. Sackel reported dramatic improvements in schizophrenic patients, and the technique spread rapidly through European and American psychiatric institutions through the late 30s and 40s. The problem was that the evidence for its effectiveness was, when examined carefully, extremely thin. A controlled study published in 1953 found that patients who received insulin coma therapy did no better than patients who received similar nursing care and rest without the comas. It was also genuinely dangerous. Some patients died, some were left with neurological damage, and the mechanism of action, to the extent anyone had a theory about it, was never convincingly established. Lobotomy is the one that lodged itself most deeply in the cultural imagination, and it deserves its reputation. Walter Freeman, who popularized the transorbital lobotomy, an icepick-style instrument inserted through the eye socket, moved around to sever connections in the prefrontal cortex, performed the procedure with a missionary zeal and a willingness to perform it on anyone whose psychiatric condition he deemed severe enough, including, at various points, people with depression, anxiety, and behavioural difficulties in children, some patients did become calmer after lobotomy. They also frequently became passive, emotionally blunted, and unable to function at any level of complexity. Rosemary Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's sister, was lobotomized in 1941 at the age of 23 and went from a young woman with mild intellectual disabilities and behavioural difficulties to someone who required full-time institutional care for the rest of her life. Freeman received the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Committee would not have another opportunity to award it for lobotomy because by the mid-1950s something better had arrived. The story of Thorazine does not begin in a psychiatric ward. It begins in a French naval surgery unit in the early 1950s, which is exactly the kind of origin story that sounds like it was made up for a film but wasn't. Henri Laborie was a French surgeon and researcher, brilliant, restless, and deeply interested in the physiological mechanisms of surgical shock. The dangerous cascade of responses that could kill a patient on the table even after a technically successful operation. He was experimenting with antihistamine compounds, looking for something that could calm the body's stress response during surgery, when he began working with a compound called promethazine. It worked, but not quite right. So Laborie contacted the pharmaceutical company Ron Poulenc and asked if they had anything similar but stronger, and they sent him chlorpromazine. Henri Laborie was the kind of scientist who annoyed his more conventionally minded colleagues. He had too many ideas, was too willing to work across disciplinary boundaries, and had a habit of arriving at conclusions before he had accumulated enough evidence to make the conventional scientific community comfortable. He was also, more often than was entirely fair, right? His interest in surgical shock arose from a very practical problem. Patients were dying during and after surgery, not from the technical failure of the operation itself, but from the body's catastrophic stress response. The flood of hormones, the circulatory instability, the series of physiological events that could kill someone who'd been technically saved by the surgeon's skill. Laborie believed that if you could blunt this stress response pharmacologically, you could improve surgical outcomes dramatically. He was right about that too. The compound that Ron Poulenc sent him, chlorpromazine, synthesized by their chemist Paul Charpentier in 1950 as part of a systematic study of phenothiazine derivatives, was different from promethazine in ways that were not immediately obvious from its chemical structure, but became very apparent in its effects. When Laborie administered it to patients as part of the lytic cocktail he was developing for surgical preparation, the result was more than he had been looking for. The patients did not just stop responding to physical stress. They stopped responding to psychological stress. They lay there, awake, aware, capable of responding to questions, but profoundly untroubled by the prospect of being cut open. Laborie described this effect with a term that entered psychiatric literature: artificial hibernation. The mind was present but detached, observing its own situation with a calm that was clearly pharmacologically produced and equally clearly unlike ordinary sedation. What Laborie recognized, and what he began insisting loudly and repeatedly to anyone who would listen, was that this effect had implications that went far beyond the operating theatre. If a drug could create this quality of psychological detachment, this capacity to remain present without being overwhelmed, in a surgical patient, what might it do for a patient in psychotic crisis? For someone whose inner experience had become so turbulent that communication, orientation, and basic self-care were impossible? Laborie was not a psychiatrist. He had no formal training in the management of mental illness. He had never worked on a psychiatric ward. He also had the advantage of not having been trained to believe that the situation was essentially hopeless, which gave him a freedom to speculate that his more experienced colleagues sometimes lacked. His persistence in advocating for psychiatric trials of chlorpromazine was not immediately rewarded with enthusiasm. The psychiatric establishment of early 1950s Paris had a certain skepticism about suggestions from surgeons. But Laborie kept pushing, writing and talking, and eventually he found psychiatrists willing to try. When Henri Laborie administered chlorpromazine to surgical patients as part of a so-called lytic cocktail, a mixture of drugs designed to depress the nervous system's response to the stress of surgery, he noticed something that had nothing to do with what he was looking for. The patients became calm, not sedated exactly, not asleep, calm, awake but indifferent, present but detached from the anxiety that typically accompanied surgical preparation. Laborie, whose intellectual appetite ran considerably wider than surgery, immediately began wondering whether this effect might have applications in psychiatry. He mentioned it to colleagues. He wrote about it. He pushed, with the enthusiasm of someone who has just seen something no one else has quite noticed yet, for the psychiatric community to take a serious look. Most of them did not immediately rush to take him up on it, because Henri Laborie was a surgeon, not a psychiatrist, and there was a professional boundary issue that had to be navigated with appropriate academic delicacy. The quality of calm that chlorpromazine produced in Laborie's surgical patients was, to him, the most interesting thing about the drug. He had worked with sedatives. He knew what sedation looked like: the drooping eyelid, the slurred response, the gradual exit from coherent engagement with the world. What chlorpromazine produced was different. A patient under its influence was not departing consciousness. They were remaining within it while being insulated from the urgency of their situation. They knew they were about to have surgery. They simply did not seem particularly concerned about this fact. They answered questions clearly. They followed instructions. They were, in the most literal sense, present. But the emotional valence of the situation had been stripped away, leaving something that looked like equanimity but was pharmacologically produced. Laborie wrote about this distinction with considerable precision, and the distinction mattered clinically. A sedative was useful before surgery because it made patients unconscious or nearly so, but it was not useful for someone who needed to remain coherent enough to communicate with medical staff, participate in their own care, or eventually leave the hospital and manage their life. What chlorpromazine appeared to offer was a third option, between full consciousness with its associated distress and sedation's removal of consciousness altogether, that had simply not previously existed in the pharmacological toolkit. Whether this distinction was immediately apparent to the psychiatric community is a more complicated question. The psychiatric wards of 1950s Paris were not especially interested in pharmacological subtlety. They were interested in patients who could be managed, who could be kept from harming themselves or others, who could be moved through the routines of ward life without requiring constant physical intervention. If a drug helped with that, the mechanism of action was somewhat secondary. But Laborie was interested in the mechanism, and it was his insistence on thinking about what the drug was actually doing, not just what it was producing at the behavioural level that pointed toward its psychiatric potential. He wrote in what became a widely cited formulation that chlorpromazine produced a state of indifference, not a loss of consciousness, not an absence of awareness, but a specific and pharmacologically produced absence of distress. The patient was there. The situation was there. The drug simply interrupted the connection between the two. For someone in the grip of acute psychosis, where that connection between inner experience and outer reality had become catastrophically distorted, the idea that a drug might offer even a partial restoration of equilibrium was, to those who thought carefully about what Laborie was describing, genuinely extraordinary. The clinical trials that would test this idea were about to begin, and the results would change psychiatry forever. The psychiatrists who eventually agreed to try chlorpromazine were Jean Delay and Pierre Dennecker, working at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris in 1952. Their first patient was a 24-year-old man named Jacques Ellis, hospitalized for acute mania, agitated, disruptive, and by the accounts of the ward staff, genuinely exhausting to manage. He had been given chlorpromazine as part of an experimental protocol, and what happened next was not subtle. Within days, he was calm, not zombified, not unconscious, calm. He was having conversations. He was oriented. The frantic energy that had characterized his presentation was gone. Delay and Dennecker were careful scientists, but even careful scientists allow themselves a moment of recognition when they are watching something genuinely new happen in front of them. They wrote up their findings, they presented them, and the psychiatric world began, very slowly at first and then all at once, to pay attention. Jean Delay was not a clinician in the conventional sense. He was a polymath, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, a novelist, and eventually a member of the Académie Française, which tells you something about the breadth of his intellectual ambition. Pierre Denneker was more clinically focused, with a particular interest in somatic treatments, the physical and pharmacological approaches to mental illness that sat on the biological side of psychiatry's ongoing, methodological argument with psychoanalysis. Together they made a complementary pair, and their collaboration on chlorpromazine was both rigorous enough to generate credible evidence and enthusiastic enough to move quickly through the skepticism that a new treatment typically encountered in conservative academic medicine. Their trial began in January of 1952, and it proceeded through a series of patients who had not responded to existing treatments, people in whom the conventional management tools of the psychiatric ward had reached their limits. What the drug did to these patients was not uniform. Some responded dramatically. Others showed partial improvement. A small number showed minimal change. But the proportion who responded, and the quality of the response in those who did, was unlike anything Delay or Denneker had seen before. Patients who had been unable to hold a coherent conversation were having one. Patients who had required restraint were sitting quietly. The ward itself, the ambient noise and tension that characterized a French psychiatric ward of the early 1950s, was measurably reduced. The paper that Delay and Denneker published in 1952, presenting their findings from the first chlorpromazine trials, introduced the term neuroleptic, literally, something that grips the neuron, to describe this new class of drug. The term was deliberate and careful, reflecting their understanding that what they were describing was a specific pharmacological action on the nervous system rather than a general sedative effect. This distinction would matter enormously as the field developed, because it pointed toward the idea that antipsychotic drugs were treating something specific, targeting specific neurological processes related to psychosis, rather than simply blunting consciousness across the board. The response from the broader psychiatric community was not immediate or universal acceptance. There were skeptics who doubted the results, critics who questioned the methodology, and clinicians who had been burned before by treatments that looked promising in small trials and proved disappointing at scale. But the results were replicable, and replication came. The ability of other clinicians in other institutions to administer the drug and observe similar effects is ultimately what persuades a medical community. Within a year of Delay and Denneker's publication, chlorpromazine was being trialled across Europe. Within 2 years, it was crossing the Atlantic. The compound that would become Thorazine arrived in the United States through the pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline & French, a Philadelphia firm that licensed the rights to chlorpromazine from Rhône-Poulenc in 1952. What followed was one of the more consequential corporate decisions in the history of American medicine, though it did not look particularly dramatic from the outside at the time. Smith, Kline & French were not a small operation, but they were also not one of the giants of the industry, and they had recently had a couple of disappointing product launches. Chlorpromazine looked, on paper, like an interesting bet. The psychiatric hospital market was enormous. There were over 500,000 people in state hospitals at any given time in the early 1950s, and there was, as their internal memos made clear, essentially no competition, because there was essentially nothing else. Smith, Kline & French had in fact been watching the European developments around chlorpromazine with considerable attention. Their licensing agreement with Rhône-Poulenc gave them exclusive rights to market the drug in the United States, and they moved quickly to begin the clinical trials that would be required for FDA approval. The trials they conducted were not, by modern standards, particularly rigorous. The regulatory environment of the early 1950s did not require the kind of large-scale randomized controlled trials that would become standard decades later, but they were adequate to demonstrate both the drug's effectiveness in reducing psychotic symptoms and, broadly, its safety profile relative to existing treatments. The company also had to decide what kind of drug chlorpromazine was, commercially speaking, which markets to position it in, which physicians to target, and how to describe its effects in terms that would resonate with the American medical community. The decision to market it primarily to psychiatrists and institutional physicians, rather than to general practitioners, was strategically sound. The state hospital market was enormous, the need was urgent and well documented, and the physicians working in those hospitals had nothing comparable to offer their patients. Getting Thorazine into the state hospitals required relatively few sales calls per $1 million of eventual revenue. But the company also saw opportunities beyond the hospitals. The word tranquilizer, which they used in their marketing, was strategically chosen to appeal to a broader medical audience. The general practitioners and internists who treated patients with anxiety, agitation, and various psychosomatic complaints. The term was elastic enough to cover a range of applications without requiring too specific a claim about mechanism of action, and it had connotations of calmness and relief that were broadly appealing. In this sense, Smith, Kline and French's marketing of Thorazine anticipated, by several decades, the approach that pharmaceutical companies would use to expand the markets for subsequent generations of psychiatric drugs. The company's investment in Thorazine paid off with unusual rapidity. Sales in the first year following FDA approval were substantial by any measure of pharmaceutical launches in that era. The drug was spreading through the hospital system through the straightforward mechanism of results. Physicians who used it saw it work, told other physicians, and the word travelled faster than any marketing campaign could have sustained. Smith, Kline and French had, largely by accident, arrived at exactly the right moment with exactly the right product, and the American psychiatric system, starved of effective treatments for decades, was ready to receive it with something remarkably close to gratitude. The process of getting chlorpromazine approved by the FDA in 1954 required Smith, Kline and French to do something that sounds straightforward but was actually genuinely complicated: explain what the drug did. The difficulty was that chlorpromazine did not fit neatly into any existing pharmacological category. It was not a sedative in the traditional sense. Sedatives made people sleepy, and chlorpromazine did something more targeted than that. It was not a stimulant. It was not an analgesic. It acted on psychosis in a way that was specific enough to be remarkable, but poorly understood enough that explaining the mechanism to a regulatory body required a certain amount of creative scientific description. The company ultimately settled on the term tranquilizer, a word that carried pleasant associations and avoided the more loaded vocabulary of psychiatry, and which was flexible enough to cover a range of effects without requiring the company to fully explain any of them. The FDA of 1954 was a substantially less powerful regulatory body than it would become after the thalidomide disaster of the early 1960s, which prompted the legislative reforms that gave the agency its modern authority to require rigorous evidence of both safety and efficacy before approving new drugs. In 1954, the bar was lower. Manufacturers needed to demonstrate that a drug was safe, but the efficacy standards were more loosely defined. Smith, Kline and French's clinical data, assembled from trials conducted primarily in psychiatric hospitals, was sufficient to demonstrate that chlorpromazine produced measurable reductions in psychotic symptoms in a substantial proportion of patients, and that the side effects, while real and sometimes serious, were manageable in a clinical setting. The naming of the drug for the American market was a small exercise in commercial linguistics. Chlorpromazine, the generic name, was accurate but not marketable. The company chose Thorazine, close enough to the chemical name to sound scientific, distinctive enough to be proprietary, and carrying in its hard consonants and clean vowels a faint suggestion of authority and reliability. It was a name that sounded like it meant business, which was appropriate for a drug that was, in fact, about to do an enormous amount of it. The FDA approval, granted on March 26, 1954, authorized Thorazine for use in managing the manifestations of psychotic disorders. The label was specific enough to establish a clear primary indication, but flexible enough to allow physicians, under the broad umbrella of clinical judgment, to use it for a range of related conditions. This flexibility would prove commercially significant, as the off-label use of Thorazine expanded well beyond the severely psychotic patients for whom it had been primarily tested, reaching patients with agitation, nausea, intractable hiccups, and various other conditions for which its sedating and dopamine-blocking properties offered some degree of symptomatic relief. What the approval did not do, because the science did not yet exist to support this, was explain why the drug worked. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, which would eventually provide the theoretical framework for understanding antipsychotic action, was not formally articulated until the 1960s, and the evidence supporting it accumulated gradually over subsequent decades. In 1954, Thorazine worked. The mechanism would have to wait. The first time a nurse on a packed psychiatric ward watched a patient who'd been screaming for 3 days sit down quietly and ask for a glass of water, it is not hard to imagine the particular quality of the silence that followed. Thorazine arrived on American psychiatric wards in 1954, and the response from ward staff was, in the documentary record, something close to astonishment. Hospitals that had been managed through physical restraint, leather cuffs, locked seclusion rooms, and the sheer organizational exhaustion of containing human beings in acute psychiatric crisis, suddenly found that the tools of containment were less necessary. Patients who had been unreachable for months were having conversations. Wards that had operated on the logic of management were being asked to operate on the logic of treatment. It was a shift so rapid and so dramatic that the people experiencing it did not always have the language to describe what was happening, only the very strong feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The accounts from nursing staff and ward physicians at state hospitals in the months following Thorazine's introduction have a quality of wonder that is difficult to manufacture and unlikely to be exaggerated, given the uniformity with which it appears across institutions that had no particular reason to tell the same story. At Rockland State Hospital in New York, where some of the earliest American trials were conducted, staff described wards that had previously operated at a constant level of noise and agitation becoming quieter. Not silent. These were still crowded, underfunded institutions housing people with serious mental illness, but measurably, noticeably quieter. Patients who had required 2 aides to move from one room to another were moving independently. Patients who had not recognized family members in years were recognizing them. The physical transformation of the wards was perhaps the most striking evidence of the drug's impact. Restraints, the leather cuffs and canvas jackets that had been a standard feature of ward management, began to disappear from daily use. Seclusion rooms, which had operated at near constant occupancy at overcrowded hospitals, were less frequently needed. The endless, grinding physical labour of containing acutely agitated patients, which had defined the working lives of psychiatric nurses for generations, was reduced by a drug that cost a few cents per dose. The economic implications of this were not lost on hospital administrators, who began to see in Thorazine not only a treatment, but a management tool that could substantially reduce staffing costs. What the drug could not do, and what it was sometimes expected to do, in the institutional enthusiasm of those early months, was cure mental illness. Thorazine reduced symptoms. It made hallucinations less vivid and less commanding. It quieted the internal noise that drove the behavioural disturbance visible on the wards, but it did not remove the underlying condition. Patients who responded dramatically to Thorazine were, in many cases, patients who could now be reached, who were now available for the therapeutic engagement, the social rehabilitation, the gradual reintegration into ordinary life that might lead somewhere. What happened next depended on what the institution and the community were able to provide, and this varied enormously, and not always in ways that led to good outcomes. But in 1954, sitting in the relative quiet of a ward that had been transformed in weeks, these were perhaps not the foremost questions. The foremost question was simpler and more immediate. Where had this been all along? Smith, Kline and French's marketing campaign for Thorazine was one of the more ambitious in pharmaceutical history at that point, which is saying something because pharmaceutical companies had already developed a refined instinct for telling doctors exactly what they wanted to hear. The company dispatched sales representatives to psychiatric hospitals across the country, brought researchers to conferences, and funded studies that could generate the kind of data that turned skeptical psychiatrists into converts. But what made the campaign particularly effective was not the salesmanship, it was the product. Thorazine sold itself, in the sense that the psychiatrists who saw it work became its most enthusiastic advocates, and word travelled through the professional community with a speed that the company could not have manufactured. Within 2 years of its introduction, Thorazine had been administered to an estimated 2 million patients in the United States. The sales force that Smith, Kline and French deployed was trained to communicate a specific message to a specific audience. The psychiatrists and hospital physicians, who were the primary targets, were not interested in the drug's chemical structure or its European origins. They were interested in what it did, how to use it, what doses to expect results at, and what the side effects required monitoring. The company's detail men, as pharmaceutical sales representatives were then called, could answer all of these questions, which gave them a clinical credibility that purely commercial salesmanship would not have established. They were, in effect, bringing information that was genuinely useful to physicians who were operating in an information-poor environment, and the physicians recognized and valued this. The company also invested heavily in conference presentations and journal advertising. The medical journals of the mid-1950s carried Thorazine advertisements that were, by modern standards, strikingly direct. Images of agitated, disruptive patients, alongside images of calm, cooperative ones, with text that attributed the transformation to the drug rather than to anything as unpredictable as individual variation or spontaneous remission. This before and after framing would become a standard of pharmaceutical marketing, and Smith, Kline, and French were among its earlier systematic practitioners. Beyond the direct marketing to physicians, the company had a more complicated relationship with the public discourse around mental illness and its treatment. The 1950s saw a substantial increase in media coverage of psychiatric topics, magazine articles about the new tranquilizers, newspaper stories about miraculous recoveries at state hospitals, television reports on the transformation of institutional psychiatry. Smith, Kline, and French did not write these stories, but they benefited from them and were not unhelpful to the journalists who did, providing access to researchers, statistics, and case materials that supported a narrative of pharmaceutical progress. The cultural moment was right for this narrative. Americans in the 1950s were broadly optimistic about science and medicine, recently reassured by the success of the Salk polio vaccine, and ready to believe that modern pharmacology could solve problems that had seemed intractable. The result was a drug that achieved market penetration at a speed that remained for some years without precedent in American pharmaceutical history. Thorazine sales in its first year exceeded Smith, Kline and French's most optimistic projections. The company reinvested in research, sales and manufacturing capacity, and across the country, in wards that had never had an effective treatment to offer, something new was happening to the patients and to the institutions that housed them. Thorazine works, insofar as neuroscience understood it in the 1950s, and as we understand it considerably better today, primarily by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain, specifically a receptor type called D2. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter involved in the regulation of movement, motivation, reward, and, crucially, certain kinds of thinking. In conditions like schizophrenia, the dopamine system appears to be dysregulated in ways that contribute to hallucinations, delusions, and the particular quality of disorganized thought that makes coherent communication with another person extremely difficult. By blocking the D2 receptor, Thorazine quiets that dysregulation. It does not cure anything. It does not address whatever underlying neurological architecture gave rise to the psychosis. It reduces symptoms, often dramatically, often within days, in a way that was, in 1954, genuinely without precedent. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia was not articulated in its full form until several years after Thorazine's introduction, which means that for the first decade of its use, the drug was working in ways that its users understood empirically, but not mechanistically. They knew it reduced psychosis. They did not know why. The why emerged gradually from a series of pharmacological investigations in the 1960s and 70s, as researchers mapped the binding profiles of chlorpromazine and its successors and established the relationship between D2 receptor blockade and antipsychotic effect. The correlation was striking. Drugs that blocked D2 receptors were antipsychotic. Drugs that did not were not. The hypothesis became the dominant theoretical framework for understanding both schizophrenia and its treatment, and it has remained influential, though considerably refined and complicated ever since. The D2 receptor is distributed throughout the brain, which is why Thorazine's effects are not limited to psychosis. The dopamine pathways relevant to antipsychotic action are primarily the mesolimbic and mesocortical systems, pathways that regulate emotion, motivation, and cognitive function. But D2 receptors also appear in the nigrostriatal pathway, which regulates motor control, and in the tuberoinfundibular pathway, which regulates hormones including prolactin. Blocking D2 receptors in the nigrostriatal pathway is what produces the movement side effects that became so characteristic of Thorazine use: the tremors, the rigidity, the Thorazine shuffle. Blocking D2 receptors in the tuberoinfundibular pathway is what causes the elevated prolactin levels that can produce breast milk production and sexual side effects in both men and women. These are not treatment failures or drug errors. They are the predictable consequences of a drug that works on a receptor system, distributed across multiple brain regions, doing what it does indiscriminately. Understanding this, that the side effects were mechanistically connected to the therapeutic effects, not accidents or impurities, was important for the subsequent development of antipsychotic drugs. If you could find compounds that more selectively blocked the mesolimbic D2 receptors while sparing the nigrostriatal ones, you might preserve the antipsychotic effect while reducing the movement side effects. This is one of the goals that drove the development of the atypical antipsychotics in the 1980s and 90s, and it was achieved to varying degrees. The atypicals do produce fewer extrapyramidal side effects, though they are not free of motor effects, and they introduce their own profile of metabolic and cardiovascular risks. What makes the brain science of Thorazine genuinely interesting and genuinely humbling is how much of it was worked out retrospectively. The drug was already transforming psychiatric practice, while the researchers were still figuring out why it worked. In medicine, this is not unusual. Aspirin was in clinical use for decades before anyone understood its mechanism of action. But in psychiatry, where the organ being treated is also the organ doing the understanding, the gap between empirical effectiveness and mechanistic knowledge has always carried a particular weight. If Thorazine's benefits were dramatic and rapid, its side effects were extensive, sometimes permanent, and in the early years of the drug's use, not always disclosed with the level of transparency that a modern patient would consider acceptable. The most immediately noticeable side effects were extrapyramidal, effects on movement that arose from the same dopamine-blocking mechanism that reduced psychosis. Patients on Thorazine developed tremors, rigidity, and a shuffling, slow-moving gait that was so characteristic of antipsychotic use that it acquired its own informal name, the Thorazine shuffle. Tardive dyskinesia, a syndrome of involuntary repetitive movements, lip-smacking, tongue protrusion, grimacing, could develop with long-term use and was often irreversible. There was also sedation, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, sensitivity to sunlight that could cause serious burns, and a condition called akathisia. a profound and relentless physical restlessness that patients described as feeling as though they could not escape their own bodies. The Thorazine shuffle is probably the most immediately recognizable of the drug's movement side effects, and it is worth dwelling on what it actually felt like, not just what it looked like, because the phenomenology matters. The rigidity and bradykinesia, slowness of movement, that Thorazine produced in a significant proportion of patients was, neurologically speaking, indistinguishable from the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease, because it arose from the same mechanism, insufficient dopamine transmission in the nigrostriatal pathway. Patients describe their movements as effortful in a new way, like moving through resistance that had not been there before. Walking across a room required thought and concentration it had not previously required. Facial expressions became difficult to produce spontaneously. The result was a characteristic appearance, flat effect, slow movement, a kind of physical hesitance that was easily misinterpreted as evidence of the underlying illness rather than a consequence of the treatment. Tardive dyskinesia was in many ways more troubling, because unlike the acute movement effects that could be managed by reducing the dose or adding another drug, tardive dyskinesia tended to emerge after months or years of treatment and could persist indefinitely after the antipsychotic was discontinued. The movements were involuntary and conspicuous, the tongue moving, the lips pursing and smacking, the face grimacing in rhythms the patient could not control. For people who were trying to reintegrate into ordinary social life, to work, to maintain relationships, to exist in public without drawing constant attention, these movements were not a minor inconvenience. They were a visible, stigmatizing marker of psychiatric treatment that followed patients into every interaction they had. Akathisia, which is perhaps less well known than tardive dyskinesia, but arguably more immediately distressing, produced a state of inner restlessness so severe that some patients described it as unbearable. The need to move, to pace, to shift, to keep the body in motion was continuous and imperious. It could not be satisfied by moving, only temporarily interrupted. Patients who experience severe akathisia sometimes describe feeling that they were trapped inside their bodies with no possible relief. This is not a sensation that encouraged medication adherence, which created a clinical paradox. The drug that reduced psychosis also produced, in a significant minority of patients, a side effect that made continued use feel intolerable. The management of these side effects consumed a substantial portion of the attention of psychiatrists working with Thorazine and its successors. Anticholinergic drugs, benztropine, trihexyphenidyl, could reduce the acute extrapyramidal effects but added their own side effects. Dose reduction helped with some symptoms but risked the return of psychosis. The clinical management of antipsychotic therapy became, in practice, a continuous negotiation between therapeutic benefit and side effect burden, a negotiation that continues with different drugs and somewhat different side effect profiles to the present day. The arrival of Thorazine did something to the professional identity of psychiatry that went beyond the clinical. It changed who psychiatrists thought they were. Before Thorazine, American psychiatry was heavily dominated by psychoanalysis, a discipline derived from Freud that focused on talk therapy, unconscious drives, the interpretation of dreams, and the long, expensive, relationship-dependent process of bringing repressed material into conscious awareness. This approach was useful for certain things and certain kinds of patients, but it was essentially useless for someone in acute psychosis, and the hospitals were full of people in acute psychosis. Thorazine offered biological psychiatry, the idea that mental illness was fundamentally a matter of brain chemistry, that it could be treated with drugs, that the doctor administering those drugs was practicing something closer to neurology than to philosophy, a foothold that it would spend the next several decades turning into a stronghold. The tension between psychoanalytic and biological psychiatry in the United States was not new in 1954. It had been present since psychoanalysis arrived from Vienna in the early 20th century. but it was largely resolved at the level of professional dominance in favour of the biological approach over the 3 decades following Thorazine's introduction. The mechanism of this resolution was not purely intellectual, it was also institutional, economic, and political. Biological psychiatry could demonstrate results measurable on standardized scales. It could be evaluated in randomized controlled trials. It could be practiced by large numbers of psychiatrists without the years of specialized training that psychoanalytic competence required. And crucially, it was pharmacological, which meant that pharmaceutical companies, with their considerable resources for funding research and supporting professional education, had a direct interest in its success. This shift had practical consequences for the patients entering the psychiatric system in the decades following Thorazine's introduction. In the psychoanalytic model, mental illness, including serious mental illness, was understood as arising from psychological conflicts, traumatic histories, and disordered relationships, and the appropriate response was a prolonged therapeutic relationship aimed at understanding and resolving these conflicts. In the biological model, mental illness was a brain disorder, and the appropriate response was medication. These models were not entirely incompatible. Serious biological psychiatrists acknowledged the role of psychological and social factors, and the best clinical care combined pharmacological and psychosocial approaches. But in practice, as resources contracted and caseloads grew, medication management increasingly became the primary, and sometimes only, intervention offered to patients with serious mental illness. What was gained in this shift was real. The ability to reduce psychotic symptoms pharmacologically changed the prognosis of schizophrenia and related conditions in ways that were clinically significant. What was sometimes lost was the sustained therapeutic relationship, the social support, the careful attention to the individual patient's experience of their illness and treatment that had been central to the best versions of the psychoanalytic approach. Biological psychiatry at its best integrated these elements. Biological psychiatry under resource pressure often did not have the luxury. The psychiatrists who came of age professionally in the post-Thorazine era were trained differently from their predecessors. They learned pharmacology. They learned to read rating scales and interpret clinical trial data. They learned to think in terms of diagnoses and treatment protocols rather than case histories and therapeutic relationships. This was not a worse kind of training. It was, in many respects, a more rigorous one. But it was a different kind of training, and what it trained psychiatrists to do and to be was meaningfully different from what had come before. The idea that people with mental illness should not live their entire lives locked in large institutions was not, in its original form, a bad idea. It was, in fact, a very good idea, rooted in genuine concern for patient dignity, genuine evidence that long-term institutionalization caused its own particular damages, and genuine optimism about what community-based care could look like if properly funded. The theoretical vision was something like this. Thorazine and its successors would stabilize patients who had previously been impossible to manage outside a hospital. Those patients would return to their communities. Community mental health centres, funded by the federal government, would provide outpatient care, medication management, therapy, social support. Families would be involved. The horrifying warehouses of the old state hospital system would close. The patients would thrive. It was a compelling vision. Several of its component parts did not survive contact with reality. The intellectual foundations of deinstitutionalization were laid in the 1950s by a confluence of different kinds of evidence and argument. Sociological research, most influentially, Erving Goffman's concept of the total institution, developed from observations he made working undercover as a staff member at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., documented the ways in which psychiatric institutions produced their own pathologies. Patients in long-term institutional settings lost the basic social skills and self-efficacy that community living required. They became institutionalized, adapted to a world that bore no resemblance to ordinary life, dependent on the routines and structures of the hospital, in ways that made return to the community progressively more difficult the longer they remained inside. the follow-up studies of patients discharged from psychiatric hospitals showing that a significant proportion could manage in the community with appropriate support, provided empirical backing for the view that hospitalization was not the only or necessarily the best response to serious mental illness. The community mental health movement, with its emphasis on outpatient care, crisis intervention and rehabilitation, offered a theoretical alternative that was both clinically credible and politically appealing. It was cheaper than hospitalization, it was more humane in theory, and it aligned with the broader social values of a period that was, in many domains, questioning the wisdom of large institutions. Thorazine made the vision plausible in a way that it had not been before. Without an effective pharmacological treatment, the discharge of patients with active psychotic symptoms into community settings was genuinely difficult to contemplate. The community had no tools for managing someone who was actively psychotic, and the patient had no way to stabilize themselves without the continuous supervision of institutional care. With Thorazine, the calculation changed. A patient who could be stabilized on medication, who could take a pill daily and have their symptoms substantially reduced, could potentially live in the community in ways that an unmedicated psychotic patient could not. The drug made the policy thinkable. What the drug could not guarantee, and what the policy required, was that patients would continue to take their medication reliably, that they would have access to psychiatric follow-up when problems arose, that they would have housing, and that the communities they returned to would have the resources to support their continued stability. Each of these requirements was assumed by the policy's architects. Each of them was, in many cases, not met. On October 31st, 1963, 3 weeks before his assassination, President John F. Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act into law, a piece of legislation that represented the federal government's most ambitious attempt to restructure American mental health care. Kennedy had a personal connection to the issue. His sister Rosemary had been lobotomized in 1941, an outcome that had devastated the family and that he did not speak about publicly, but that clearly informed his engagement with the question of how America cared for people with cognitive and psychiatric disabilities. The Act authorized funding for a network of community mental health centers across the country, the infrastructure that was supposed to receive and support patients being discharged from state hospitals. Congress authorized the money, the centers began to be built, and then, over the course of the following decade, the funding was cut, redirected, or simply never fully appropriated, and the infrastructure that the entire deinstitutionalization project depended on was never completed. Kennedy's address to Congress in February of 1963, which laid out the administration's mental health agenda, was notable for both its ambition and its specificity. He described a plan to reduce the population in state psychiatric hospitals by 50% over 10 years, a number that was both concrete and, as it turned out, an underestimate of what actually happened, and to replace the institutional care being reduced with a comprehensive network of community mental health centres providing a range of services: inpatient care for acute crises, outpatient therapy, partial hospitalization programs, emergency services, and consultation and education for community providers. The vision was genuinely comprehensive, and the legislative language that translated it into the Community Mental Health Act was designed to create the infrastructure for a system that could actually deliver on it. The political history of the Act after Kennedy's assassination is a story of gradual underfunding that tracked the broader fiscal pressures of the 1960s and 70s. The original legislation authorized construction funding for 2,000 community mental health centers, a number that was never approached. Staffing grants were authorized but not consistently appropriated. The Nixon administration, not philosophically committed to the federal role in social services that the Act embodied, reduced support. The Ford and Carter administrations made various attempts to restore and restructure the program with varying success. By the time the Reagan administration consolidated what remained into block grants in 1981, effectively ending the federal commitment to the Community Mental Health Center network, the centers that had been built were providing services to a population that, in many cases, was not the severely mentally ill population the Act had been designed to serve. The centres that existed tended, for structural and practical reasons, to serve clients who were easier to treat, people with anxiety, depression and adjustment difficulties, rather than the chronically and severely mentally ill patients, whose needs were most acute and most resource-intensive. This was not always a deliberate choice. It was often the result of staffing patterns, reimbursement structures, and the basic human tendency of institutions to do what they are equipped to do, rather than what the most difficult cases require. But the result was a network of outpatient services that did not, in any systematic way, replace the institutional care that was simultaneously being dismantled. Kennedy signed the Act 3 weeks before Dallas. His vision for what it could become died with him, not immediately and not entirely, but incrementally, through the bureaucratic and fiscal attrition that attends any ambitious policy initiative that loses its most powerful champion. The discharge statistics from American state psychiatric hospitals in the 1960s and 70s tell a story in numbers that is both impressive and, depending on your perspective, deeply troubling. In 1955, there were approximately 559,000 patients in state psychiatric hospitals across the United States. By 1980, that number had fallen to approximately 132,000. This was presented at various points as evidence of Thorazine's success, evidence of enlightened social policy, and evidence that the old institutional system was finally being dismantled in favour of something better. What it was also evidence of, and what took longer to become visible in the official narrative, was that a very large number of people had been discharged into communities that were not equipped to receive them, support them, or keep them housed. The process of emptying the state hospitals was not uniform across states or across time. Different states adopted deinstitutionalization policies at different paces and with different levels of investment in community alternatives. California, under Governor Ronald Reagan beginning in 1967, moved particularly aggressively toward hospital closure and discharge, simultaneously cutting state hospital funding in ways that accelerated patient discharge beyond the pace at which community services were being developed. The Lanterman-Petrus Short Act, passed in California in 1967 and effective in 1972, reformed the legal standards for involuntary psychiatric commitment, a genuinely important civil liberties reform that also had the practical effect of making it substantially more difficult to keep people in hospitals against their will, even when discharge was not clinically appropriate. The legal reforms around civil commitment that occurred across many states during the 1970s reflected genuine concerns about the abuse of involuntary hospitalization. The old commitment standards had given psychiatrists and hospitals enormous latitude to confine people against their will for indefinite periods, and this latitude had been exercised in ways that were sometimes clearly unjust. People committed for reasons that were more social than clinical. People from marginalized communities disproportionately hospitalized. People held long after any therapeutic rationale for their confinement had expired. The reforms that raised the evidentiary bar for commitment, requiring demonstration of immediate dangerousness rather than general inability to care for oneself, were defensible on civil liberties grounds. They also made it harder to maintain in institutional care people who were seriously ill but not acutely dangerous, which contributed to discharge patterns that the community infrastructure was not prepared to absorb. The patients who were discharged in the largest numbers during this period were not, for the most part, the patients who had been most recently admitted and were most likely to have maintained community connections and support systems. They were often the long-term patients, people who had spent years or decades in the hospital, who had no recent experience of community living, whose families had often lost contact with them, and who had the fewest resources for managing the transition to life outside an institution. These were the patients for whom the gap between the stated vision of community care and its actual implementation was most consequential and most visible. The story of deinstitutionalization, as it actually unfolded for many of the patients discharged from state hospitals, is one of the more uncomfortable chapters in American social policy, not because the intentions were malicious, but because the gap between the policy as designed and the policy as implemented was so wide that the people falling through it were, in many cases, the most vulnerable people in the country. Patients discharged with prescriptions for Thorazine and its successors needed, at minimum, consistent access to medication, regular psychiatric follow-up, housing, and some degree of social support. Many received none of these things reliably. The community mental health centres that were supposed to provide ongoing care were often understaffed, underfunded, or focused on populations. The anxious, the mildly depressed, people who could show up for appointments and advocate for themselves, who were easier to serve than the severely mentally ill. The medication question was perhaps the most immediately consequential. Thorazine and the other first-generation antipsychotics worked, for the most part, when people took them. The problem was that the side effects, the Thorazine shuffle, the sedation, the akathisia, the sexual dysfunction, made consistent adherence difficult for many patients, and the absence of regular psychiatric follow-up meant that dose adjustments and side effect management were not available to smooth the path. A patient discharged from a state hospital with a 30-day supply of Thorazine and a referral to a community mental health centre that had a 3-month waiting list was, in practical terms, not receiving continuing care. They were receiving a medication supply and a phone number. The housing situation was often equally dire. The boarding houses and single-room occupancy hotels that absorbed many discharged psychiatric patients in the 1960s and 70s were cheap, minimally supervised, and concentrated in the most economically distressed urban neighbourhoods. They provided a roof, but not the structure, support, or social engagement that might help a person with serious mental illness maintain stability. Many discharged patients drifted through a sequence of these arrangements: boarding house to adult family home to cheap hotel to a relative's sofa, without ever finding a stable base from which to manage their illness and their lives. The families who were sometimes asked to receive discharged patients often did so without preparation, training, or support. The family psychoeducation programs that would eventually become a standard component of community mental illness care were not widely available in the early deinstitutionalization period. Families were simply told that their relative was being discharged, given medication instructions, and sent home with someone whose illness they did not fully understand and whose behaviour could be frightening, exhausting, and impossible to manage without professional support. Some families managed heroically under these circumstances. Others, sometimes through lack of resources, sometimes through exhaustion, sometimes through the accumulated damage of years of difficult relationships, were unable to sustain the caregiving role. The visible consequences of these failures began to accumulate in American cities by the 1970s and became unmistakable in the 1980s. The people who had been discharged from state hospitals and could not maintain stable community lives were not disappearing. They were on the streets, in the shelters, in the emergency rooms and jail cells and criminal courts that became, by default, the mental health system for people the formal mental health system could not reach. One of the unintended consequences of deinstitutionalization that became visible in American cities by the 1970s was a phenomenon that researchers and clinicians began calling the revolving door, a cycle in which people with serious mental illness were discharged from hospitals, stopped taking their medication, decompensated, became acutely psychotic, were brought back to the hospital by police or emergency services, stabilized on medication, and discharged again, often in weeks rather than months, because the hospitals no longer had the beds or the mandate for long-term care. The cycle was cruel in its efficiency. It produced neither the liberation that deinstitutionalization had promised, nor the stability that the old institutional system had, at its best, provided. It produced instead a kind of perpetual transit, people moving between crisis and discharge in a loop that served no one particularly well, least of all the person at its centre. The length of psychiatric hospitalization declined dramatically across the deinstitutionalization period, driven by a combination of policy, economics, and the availability of medication. Where the average length of stay in a state hospital had been measured in years in the 1950s, it was measured in weeks by the 1970s and in days by the 1980s. This compression of inpatient stays reflected a genuine philosophical change. The view that hospitalization should be the most acute and intensive intervention, reserved for the most severe crises, with community care providing the ongoing maintenance. But it also reflected the economic incentives of a system that was under fiscal pressure and had learned to define adequate stabilization as symptom reduction, sufficient for discharge rather than genuine functional recovery. The Medicaid funding structure that developed in the 1960s and 70s contributed to the revolving door in ways that were largely unintentional. Federal Medicaid dollars flowed to community hospitals and emergency departments, but were specifically excluded from state psychiatric hospitals under the Institutions for Mental Diseases exclusion, a provision that had been designed to encourage community care, but had the practical effect of creating financial incentives to discharge patients from state hospitals quickly and to readmit them to general hospital emergency departments and psychiatric units when crisis recurred. The result was a pattern of care that was more expensive in aggregate, less therapeutic in nature, and maximally disruptive for the patients cycling through it. For the patients themselves, the revolving door was an experience of perpetual instability. Each hospitalization was brief enough to stabilize medication and control the most acute symptoms, but rarely long enough to address the social circumstances, housing, relationships, support systems that had contributed to decompensation. Each discharge sent the patient back to the same community environment, often without the changed circumstances that might have made a different outcome possible. Each readmission reset the clock on a process that never reached a stable resolution. Over time, the repeated hospitalizations compounded the social and functional losses associated with serious mental illness, making it progressively harder for patients to hold jobs, maintain relationships, and manage the practical demands of community living. The term revolving door captured something real about the experience, but it also had the rhetorical disadvantage of suggesting that the patient was responsible for the cycle, that they kept coming back because they kept making the same mistakes. The structural analysis that the cycle was produced by a system that discharged people too quickly into environments too unsupportive to sustain their stability was less prominent in popular discourse, which tended to locate the problem in medication non-adherence or patient irresponsibility rather than in the underfunding of community support. It would be overly generous, and also inaccurate, to describe deinstitutionalization purely as a humane reform motivated by concern for patient welfare. There was another factor, less discussed in the policy documents but consistently present in the budget conversations. State hospitals were extremely expensive to operate. Each patient in a state institution represented a significant ongoing cost to the state budget: staffing, facilities, food, medication, administration. Thorazine offered state legislators something they had not previously had: a medically credible justification for reducing that cost. If patients could be managed in the community on medication rather than in hospitals, the hospitals could be closed or dramatically downsized, and the savings were real and immediate. The community services that were supposed to replace the hospitals would cost money too, but that money was easier not to appropriate once the patients were already gone and the wards were already closing. The per-patient daily cost of state hospital care in the 1950s was substantial enough to represent a significant line item in state budgets that were under persistent fiscal pressure. The prospect of reducing this cost and deinstitutionalization, if implemented as described, would reduce it, Yambrest, was politically appealing in a way that transcended ideology. Conservative legislators who were philosophically skeptical of large state institutions found common cause with liberal reformers who believed in community care and patient rights, united by the practical attraction of a policy that appeared to save money while also doing good. This coalition, which looked principled from the outside, had an economic engine driving it that was not always visible in the rhetoric. The timing of the most aggressive hospital closures tracks closely with periods of fiscal pressure rather than with the development of community infrastructure. California's rapid reduction in state hospital beds in the late 1960s and early 1970s coincided with Governor Reagan's broader program of cutting state government spending, a coincidence that was not exactly coincidental. New York's hospital closures in the 1970s were accompanied by a fiscal crisis that reduced the state's overall capacity for social spending. The pattern repeats across states and decades. When money was tight, hospital beds were cut. When hospital beds were cut, the justification invoked was deinstitutionalization. When the community services were supposed to replace them were not funded, the justification was no longer in the budget conversation. The physical plants of the old state hospitals, large campuses with substantial buildings and acreage, often in or near growing suburban areas, had real estate value that provided an additional incentive for closure. Selling or repurposing hospital land could generate one-time revenues that helped close budget gaps. Some of the most dramatic hospital closures of the deinstitutionalization period were accompanied by real estate transactions that realized significant value from the former institutional properties. The patients who had lived on these campuses were not always the primary consideration in these negotiations. What remained, once the hospitals had been closed and the land had been sold and the community infrastructure had not been built, was a mental health system with substantially reduced capacity for the most severely ill patients and substantially increased reliance on the goodwill, resourcefulness, and endurance of the families, communities, and informal networks that were expected to fill the gap. These systems filled the gap imperfectly, which is a diplomatic way of describing what happened to a significant number of people. Thorazine was the first antipsychotic, but it was not the last. Over the following decades, pharmaceutical companies developed a series of related compounds, haloperidol, thioridazine, fluphenazine, that worked on similar principles and offered various trade-offs in terms of potency and side effect profiles. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, a new class of antipsychotics emerged: clozapine, risperidone, olanzapine, quetiapine, that were marketed as atypical antipsychotics, drugs that worked on a broader range of neurotransmitter systems and that were claimed, initially, to produce fewer of the movement-related side effects that had made Thorazine and its relatives so physically difficult for patients to tolerate. The atypicals were genuinely useful. They also came with their own side effect profiles: significant weight gain, metabolic changes, elevated diabetes risk, that turned out to be serious enough that the framing of them as straightforward improvements was eventually complicated. The development of the first-generation antipsychotics after Thorazine proceeded through the 1950s and 60s by a combination of systematic chemical modification and clinical observation. Haloperidol, synthesized by the Belgian chemist Paul Janssen in 1958, was dramatically more potent than chlorpromazine, effective at doses measured in milligrams rather than the hundreds of milligrams that chlorpromazine required. This potency was clinically useful for managing severe agitation and acute psychosis, but it also meant that the D2 blocking effects were concentrated and intense, and the extrapyramidal side effects were correspondingly more severe. Haloperidol became the workhorse antipsychotic of the 1960s and 70s, widely used and widely associated with the movement side effects that defined the first generation. The atypical antipsychotics that emerged from the 1980s onward were the product of a more sophisticated pharmacological understanding, an attempt to design drugs that retained the antipsychotic effect of D2 blockade while reducing the movement side effects by acting on serotonin receptors simultaneously, or by binding to the D2 receptor in a way that was less tightly locked and more readily displaced. The clinical trials that supported the approval of risperidone, olanzapine, and quetiapine in the 1990s showed that they were effective antipsychotics with a side effect profile that, at least on the dimension of movement effects, was more favourable than the first generation. pharmaceutical companies marketed them aggressively at prices dramatically higher than the generic first-generation drugs, and the psychiatric community, shaped by the accumulated evidence that the first-generation side effects were a major driver of medication non-adherence, adopted them rapidly. The metabolic side effects of the atypicals became clear over time. Olanzapine in particular was associated with dramatic weight gain. Gains of 20, 30 or more pounds were not uncommon, and with increases in blood sugar and lipids that substantially elevated cardiovascular risk. This was not a minor inconvenience in a patient population already at elevated cardiovascular risk due to lifestyle factors, smoking, and poverty. The metabolic consequences of atypical antipsychotic use became a significant clinical problem, generating its own body of research, its own treatment protocols, and eventually its own pharmaceutical market for drugs to manage the metabolic complications of the antipsychotics. Whether the atypicals represented a genuine clinical advance over the first generation or primarily a commercial success is a question that is still debated in the literature. The evidence from large comparative effectiveness trials, most notably the Katie trial, published in 2005, suggested that the differences between atypicals and the best-tolerated first-generation drugs were less dramatic than the marketing had suggested, and that the clinical decision about which drug to use for which patient was more complicated than the simple atypical versus typical framing implied. Of all the antipsychotics that followed Thorazine, clozapine occupies a particular position in the history of psychiatric pharmacology, effective enough to be genuinely remarkable for patients who had not responded to anything else, and dangerous enough that its use required a monitoring protocol that made it, in practical terms, inaccessible to many of the people who might have benefited from it most. Clozapine was actually developed in the 1960s and came to clinical attention before the other atypicals, but an early European clinical trial revealed that it could cause a granulocytosis, a potentially fatal collapse of the white blood cell counters, in a small percentage of patients, and it was withdrawn from the market in several countries as a result. It was reintroduced in the United States in 1989 for treatment-resistant schizophrenia, but with a mandatory blood monitoring requirement that meant patients needed regular blood draws to stay on it, a requirement that proved prohibitive for many people who lacked stable housing or reliable access to medical care. Clozapine's effectiveness in treatment-resistant schizophrenia, the 30% or so of people with schizophrenia who do not respond adequately to other antipsychotics, is well established and genuinely remarkable. The drug reduces positive symptoms in patients for whom other antipsychotics have failed. It appears to reduce suicidality, one of the most serious risks associated with schizophrenia, in ways that other antipsychotics do not. It does not produce the extrapyramidal side effects that characterize the first generation, because it does not bind D2 receptors as tightly. For the patients who respond to it and can tolerate its monitoring requirements, it is a life-changing medication. The story of why clozapine is underused is a story about the gap between pharmacological effectiveness and practical accessibility. The blood monitoring requirement, originally weekly, later reduced to monthly after 2 years of stable treatment for most patients, is medically rational given the granulocytosis risk, which, while affecting only about 1% of patients, can progress to fatal infection very rapidly if not caught early. But the practical implications of weekly or monthly blood draws for a population that includes many people who are homeless, unstable, or mistrustful of medical systems are substantial. Getting a blood draw requires showing up at a lab on a regular schedule with appropriate identification, tolerating the physical procedure, and ensuring that the results are transmitted to the prescribing physician in time for the next dispensing. Each of these steps is a barrier, and the barriers compound. The pharmaceutical and regulatory systems have made various attempts to reduce the friction of clozapine monitoring, including a centralized registry system that tracks monitoring compliance and allows pharmacies to dispense only when appropriate blood results are on file. But the fundamental challenge remains. The patients most likely to benefit from clozapine, because they have not responded to anything else and have therefore had the most difficult and disrupted treatment histories, are often the patients least able to navigate the monitoring requirements. The result is a drug that is remarkably effective in controlled settings and persistently underutilized in the real world. Clozapine's trajectory also illustrates something important about how the psychiatric system evaluates risk and benefit. The agranular psychosis risk is real and serious but affects a small minority of patients. The benefit for the patients who respond is substantial. Yet the monitoring burden has limited uptake in ways that have left many treatment-resistant patients on less effective medications for years, accumulating disability and impairment that might have been prevented with earlier access to clozapine. The calculus of acceptable risk in psychiatry is not always calculated in favor of the patient. By the early 1980s, the consequences of a deinstitutionalization that had proceeded without its promised community infrastructure were visible in American cities in a way that was impossible to ignore. Homelessness in the United States had become both more visible and more severe, and researchers and advocates began documenting what clinicians on the ground had already noticed. A very significant proportion of the chronically homeless population had serious mental illness. Estimates varied, but studies consistently found rates of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and other severe psychiatric conditions among homeless adults that were dramatically higher than in the general population. These were, in many cases, people who'd been discharged from state hospitals in the previous decade, who had lost access to medication and follow-up care, who had cycled through emergency rooms and jails and shelters without receiving sustained treatment, and who were living on the streets of cities that had not asked for this outcome and were not prepared to address it. The increase in visible homelessness in American cities in the early 1980s was attributed in popular and political discourse to various causes. The recession of 1981, cuts in federal housing programs, the general dissolution of urban social fabric, and deinstitutionalization was often treated as one factor among many, rather than a central driver. The relationship between psychiatric deinstitutionalization and the growth of homelessness is genuinely complex. Not all homeless people had histories of psychiatric hospitalization, and not all discharged psychiatric patients became homeless. But the evidence that there was a substantial overlap between the discharged psychiatric population and the emerging homeless population was clear enough to clinicians working in urban shelters and emergency rooms. What the visible presence of mentally ill individuals on city streets did to public discourse about mental illness was complicated. It raised the salience of the issue in ways that the closed wards of state hospitals had not. People encountering severely mentally ill individuals on the street were confronting the reality of untreated serious mental illness in a way that the institutional system had previously shielded them from. This sometimes generated sympathy and advocacy. It also sometimes generated fear, hostility, and demands for the kind of social control, involuntary commitment, criminalization of street behavior that the civil liberties movement of the previous decade had worked to constrain. The political response to visible mental illness on the streets was never consistently humane or adequately resourced. Cities cycled through various approaches, sweeps that moved people from one location to another without addressing their underlying circumstances, shelter systems that were chronically overcrowded and underserved, outreach programs that were too small to reach the population in need, without arriving at a sustained commitment to the kind of supported housing and integrated care that the evidence suggested was most effective. The people on the streets remained there, cycling through emergency services, cycling through jails, cycling through the remnants of a system that had been designed for something very different from what it was being asked to do. One of the most consequential and least intended consequences of deinstitutionalization was the gradual transfer of large numbers of people with serious mental illness from psychiatric institutions to correctional institutions. As state hospitals closed and community services failed to materialize, people in psychiatric crisis increasingly came into contact with the criminal justice system rather than the mental health system, arrested for behaviors that were symptoms of untreated illness, incarcerated in jails and prisons that were not equipped to provide psychiatric treatment, and released back into the community with the same lack of support that had preceded their arrest. By the early 21st century, it was widely observed that the Los Angeles County Jail, Rikers Island in New York, and the Cook County Jail in Chicago each held more people with serious mental illness than the largest remaining psychiatric hospitals in their respective states, a statistic that encapsulates the particular failure of a policy that meant to do something very different. The pathway from mental illness to incarceration is not mysterious. When someone in acute psychiatric crisis behaves in ways that are alarming, threatening, or criminal. And psychosis can produce behavior that is all three, without the person having any meaningful awareness of what they're doing or why. The available institutional response in most American communities is a police response. Police are trained to respond to threats and to enforce the law. They are not, for the most part, trained to recognize and manage psychiatric crisis in ways that divert people from the criminal justice system. Some police departments have developed crisis intervention programs that improve their response to mental health calls with meaningful results. Most have not, because these programs cost money and require sustained commitment that has not always been available. Once a person with serious mental illness enters the criminal justice system, the institutional logic of that system tends to be poorly suited to their needs. Jails and prisons operate on schedules, rules, and behavioral expectations that can be extremely difficult for someone with active psychotic symptoms to navigate. Non-compliance with institutional rules, itself often a symptom of illness rather than intentional defiance, generates disciplinary consequences that compound the situation. Solitary confinement, used as disciplinary measure in many correctional facilities, is associated with severe psychiatric decompensation in people with serious mental illness, and its use for this population is a documented source of significant harm. The psychiatric treatment available in most American jails and prisons ranges from inadequate to essentially non-existent. Medication may be prescribed but not consistently available or reliably administered. Mental health staffing is chronically insufficient relative to the prevalence of psychiatric conditions in the population. The environment of a correctional facility, the noise, the threat, the lack of privacy and autonomy is not conducive to psychiatric stability. And upon release, the situation typically resets to where it was before arrest. Inadequate community support, unreliable medication access, unstable housing, with the additional burden of a criminal record that reduces employment and housing opportunities further. The criminalization of mental illness is perhaps the most visible evidence that the deinstitutionalization project failed not just as a social policy, but as a moral commitment. The people who left the state hospitals were supposed to be liberated into a more humane and a more effective system of care. For a significant number of them, the destination was not community life, but a different institution, one less expensive to operate, less therapeutically oriented, and more damaging in its effects. The history of Thorazine is often told from the perspective of the doctors who prescribed it, the researchers who studied it, the policymakers who cited it, and the institutions that were transformed by it. The perspective that receives somewhat less attention is that of the people who actually took it. Patient accounts of Thorazine are varied, which is perhaps unsurprising for a drug that produced such variable effects across individuals and across conditions. Some patients described the medication as genuinely liberating. The quieting of voices that had been relentless, the return of the ability to think in a linear way, the re-establishment of contact with a world that psychosis had made inaccessible. Others described it in terms that were considerably darker: a chemical restraint, a fog, a flattening of experience that removed not only the worst symptoms of illness, but also the texture of ordinary feeling. The accounts of liberation are real and deserve to be taken seriously. For patients who had been lost in psychosis, unable to distinguish their own thoughts from external voices, unable to organize experience into anything coherent, unable to communicate with the people around them, the reduction in symptoms that Thorazine provided was not a small thing. It was the difference between being inside an experience that made reality inaccessible and being able to sit in a chair, recognize a family member's face, and participate in a conversation about what came next. Some patients describe this as a return to themselves, a re-emergence of a self that the illness had obscured. The relief in these accounts is genuine, and the gratitude for a drug that made it possible is understandable. The accounts of loss are equally real. The Thorazine that quieted the voices also, in many cases, quieted everything else. The emotional responsiveness, the spontaneity, the pleasure in small things that constituted ordinary conscious experience. Patients who had been vividly, intensely alive inside their psychosis, however disturbing that aliveness was, sometimes found the medicated state emptied out in ways that were their own kind of loss. The word zombie appears in patient accounts of Thorazine with enough regularity to indicate that it described something real, a quality of disconnection from inner experience, of living at one remove from the emotions and impulses that normally give life its texture. The physical side effects compounded this experience. Moving slowly through a world that moved at normal speed was disorienting and isolating. The inability to sit still that akathisia produced was a continuous source of distress that had no relief. The visible, uncontrollable movements of tardive dyskinesia mark the person in public as psychiatric, as medicated, as other, in ways that reinforced the stigma that mental illness already carried. Patients who developed these movement effects described them not as neutral side effects to be managed, but as indignities, as the medication writing itself on their bodies in ways they had not consented to and could not remove. What emerges from the patient accounts taken together is a picture of Thorazine's clinical reality that is considerably more ambivalent than either its proponents or its critics typically acknowledged. It did real good for many people. It also imposed real costs. The question of whether the good outweighed the costs was one that each patient had to answer individually, from inside their own experience, and the answer was not always what the physicians who prescribed the drug assumed it would be. The 1960s and 1970s produced, alongside the deinstitutionalization movement, a parallel and sometimes overlapping current of thought that went by the name of antipsychiatry, a loose collection of theorists, activists, and former patients who questioned the basic premises of psychiatric diagnosis and treatment in ways that range from the intellectually serious to the ideologically extreme. Thomas Szasz, a psychiatrist himself, argued in his 1960 book The Myth of Mental Illness that mental illness as a category was a social construction used to pathologize deviance and justify coercive control. R.D. Laing, a Scottish psychiatrist, proposed that schizophrenia was in some cases a sane response to an insane family or social environment. Irving Goffman's sociological work documented the ways in which psychiatric institutions produced their own particular forms of damage. Ken Kesey's novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, published in 1962 and adapted into an Oscar-winning film in 1975, gave these critiques a narrative form that reached a vastly wider audience than any academic argument. Sasz's argument was philosophically rigorous and politically radical in ways that generated enormous controversy and that continue to be debated today. He distinguished between illnesses that had demonstrable biological causes, broken legs, infections, brain tumours, and the conditions that psychiatry called mental illness, which he argued were more accurately understood as problems in living or moral judgments disguised as medical diagnoses. He was not arguing that the suffering associated with mental illness was unreal. He was arguing that calling that suffering an illness and granting medical authorities the power to define it and treat it involuntarily was a category error with serious civil liberties consequences. His position was sharpest when applied to the use of psychiatric diagnosis to justify involuntary treatment, which he opposed absolutely. Laing's contribution was different in character, more experiential, more interested in the phenomenology of psychosis and the relational context in which it arose. His early work, particularly The Divided Self, was a sustained attempt to make the experience of schizophrenia intelligible from the inside, to understand psychotic symptoms as meaningful responses to impossible relational situations rather than meaningless symptoms of brain disease. Whatever the empirical merits of this position, which are disputed, it was a genuine attempt to take seriously the inner life of people who had been treated as though they had no inner life worth attending to. His later work became more speculative and less clinically grounded, but the core impulse to listen carefully to what people called psychotic were actually experiencing has influenced psychiatric practice in ways that persist. The anti-psychiatry movement was not internally consistent. Szasz and Laing had fundamental disagreements with each other. The survivor movement, the organised voice of people with personal experience of psychiatric treatment, shared some of the anti-psychiatry critique but had its own concerns and its own demands, focused on patient rights, informed consent, and the end of involuntary treatment, that did not map cleanly onto the theoretical positions of the academic critics. What united these various currents was a skepticism about the power of psychiatric institutions to define normalcy, a concern about the civil liberties implications of that power, and a conviction that the experience of mental illness deserved to be taken seriously on its own terms, rather than explained away by a medical model that was more comfortable with symptoms than with people. The mainstream psychiatric community's response to anti-psychiatry was often defensive, which was understandable but not always helpful. The critiques, at their best, pointed to real problems: the history of institutional abuse, the overreach of involuntary commitment, the power imbalance between psychiatrists and patients, the side effects of medications that were sometimes minimized in ways that did not serve patients well. Dismissing these critiques entirely was easier than engaging with them, but the engagement, when it eventually happened, produced real reforms in how informed consent was understood and practiced in psychiatry. The deepest and most lasting impact of Thorazine may not be the drug itself, but what the drug implied, what it suggested about the nature of mental illness and, by extension, about the nature of the mind. Before Thorazine, the dominant model in American psychiatry was broadly psychoanalytic. Mental illness arose from psychological causes, from unconscious conflicts, from the dynamics of early relationships and family systems. After Thorazine, the dominant model shifted, not overnight, not completely, not without significant resistance, toward the biological. Mental illness was a brain disorder, a matter of chemistry, something that could be addressed with drugs the way diabetes was addressed with insulin. This shift had consequences that went far beyond the treatment of schizophrenia. It shaped how subsequent generations of psychiatrists were trained, how research funding was allocated, how pharmaceutical companies positioned themselves in relation to the profession, and how the general public came to understand what it meant to have a mental illness. The insulin analogy, the idea that taking an antipsychotic for schizophrenia was like a diabetic taking insulin for diabetes, became a common way of explaining psychiatric medication to patients and to the public, and it was used with the explicit intention of reducing stigma. If mental illness was a medical condition like any other, caused by a chemical imbalance that could be corrected by a pill, then there was no more reason to be ashamed of having schizophrenia than of having diabetes. The analogy was well-intentioned and psychoeducationally useful, and it did, in some contexts, reduce the kind of stigma that attributed mental illness to weakness of character or failure of will. It also significantly oversimplified the science. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia is a real and important insight, but schizophrenia is not simply a dopamine deficiency in the way that type 1 diabetes is an insulin deficiency. The neurological reality of schizophrenia involves multiple neurotransmitter systems, complex interactions between genetic vulnerability and environmental stress, developmental trajectories that extend back to before birth, and cognitive and social dimensions that are not adequately captured by the chemical imbalance framing. The insulin analogy, by reducing a complex multidimensional condition to a single correctable deficit, made the biology of mental illness seem simpler and more fully understood than it actually was, and more importantly, made pharmacological treatment seem more complete than it actually was. The biological framing also had effects on how stigma operated, not all of them in the intended direction. Some research found that framing mental illness as a brain disease, while reducing the attribution of personal blame, simultaneously increased social distance. The sense that people with mental illness were fundamentally different, less predictable, and more dangerous. This is a counterintuitive finding, but it makes a kind of sense. If someone's brain is structurally different from yours in ways that produce frightening behavior, that may be more alarming than if their behavior results from understandable, if extreme, psychological distress. The biology of mental illness does not in itself make it less frightening, and the effort to reduce stigma through biological explanation has had mixed results. What Thorazine's legacy most clearly established is that the mind is physical, that what we experience as thoughts, emotions, and perceptions is the product of physical processes in the brain that can be altered by chemical intervention. This is a profound insight, not because it is new, philosophers and physiologists had been arguing for versions of it for centuries, but because Thorazine made it undeniably, clinically real. A drug could change a person's mind, change their experience of reality, return them, at least partially, to a self that psychosis had made inaccessible. Whatever the drug's limitations, this was genuinely extraordinary, and it has shaped every conversation about the mind, the brain, and the treatment of mental illness in the 7 decades since. The antipsychotic market today looks very different from the one that Thorazine entered in 1954, though it operates on principles that would be recognizable to the researchers who conducted those first trials in Paris. There are dozens of antipsychotic medications available, ranging from the original typical antipsychotics, still used in some contexts, through the atypicals that dominated the 1990s and 2000s, to newer compounds that attempt to target specific receptor systems with greater precision and fewer systemic effects. Long-acting injectable formulations, antipsychotics that can be administered once a month or once every 3 months rather than requiring daily oral medication, have addressed one of the most consistent practical problems in treating schizophrenia: the difficulty of sustaining medication adherence in people whose illness itself can impair their ability to maintain a daily routine. The science has improved substantially. The gap between what we know and what we can do remains uncomfortably wide. The development of long-acting injectable antipsychotics, sometimes called depots, from the French word for a storage facility, represents one of the more clinically significant advances in antipsychotic pharmacology since Thorazine. First-generation depot formulations, available from the 1970s, allowed haloperidol and fluphenazine to be administered by injection every 2 to 4 weeks, removing the daily adherence requirement that was a major source of treatment failure. The development of second-generation depot formulations, long-acting injectable versions of risperidone, paliperidone, aripiprazole, and other atypicals, extended this approach to the newer drugs with their more favourable side effect profiles. The clinical evidence for long-acting injectables in reducing relapse and rehospitalization is substantial. Studies consistently show that patients on depot formulations have fewer psychiatric hospitalizations than patients on oral medications, even when controlling for other factors. This makes sense at a basic level. A patient cannot forget to take an injection they received 3 weeks ago, in the same way they can forget a daily pill, but the effect goes beyond simple adherence. The predictability of drug delivery that depot formulations provide allows for more stable blood levels, which may contribute to more stable symptom control. For patients who have had multiple relapses associated with medication discontinuation, long-acting injectables can interrupt the relapse cycle in ways that substantially change the trajectory of illness. The newer agents that have entered the antipsychotic market in the 21st century include drugs with novel mechanisms of action that go beyond D2 blockade. Aripiprazole, which acts as a partial agonist at the D2 receptor, stabilizing dopamine transmission rather than simply blocking it, represents a different pharmacological approach that reduces some of the side effects associated with complete D2 blockade. More recently, compounds targeting other receptor systems, including trace amine-associated receptor 1, or TAR1, have shown promise in clinical trials, suggesting that the next generation of antipsychotics may work through mechanisms that Thorazine's pharmacologists could not have anticipated. What has not changed, despite 7 decades of development, is the fundamental challenge of treating a condition that we do not fully understand at the level of its biology. The dopamine hypothesis remains important and productive, but schizophrenia is almost certainly more heterogeneous than a single hypothesis can capture. Different patients likely have different underlying biological disturbances, which may explain why no single drug works for everyone, and why treatment-resistant schizophrenia remains a clinical reality for a substantial minority of patients. The development of genuinely personalized psychiatric pharmacology, matching specific drugs to specific biological subtypes of illness, remains an aspiration rather than a clinical reality. Standing at some distance from the events described in this episode, from the French Naval Surgery Unit where Henri Laborie first noticed something interesting, to the state hospital wards where Thorazine seemed to change everything, to the streets of American cities where some of the consequences of that change became visible in the 1980s and beyond, the question of whether things were handled correctly is one that does not resolve cleanly into a yes or a no. Thorazine was, undeniably, a genuine medical breakthrough, a drug that reduced suffering for millions of people in ways that had simply not been possible before its introduction. Deinstitutionalization, as a principle, reflected a genuine moral insight, that people with mental illness deserve to live in their communities, not warehoused in institutions. The failure was not in the vision. The failure was in the execution, in the political decisions that closed the hospitals faster than the community infrastructure could be built, in the funding that was promised and not delivered, in the comfort with which a society was willing to accept discharged patients on its sidewalks once they were no longer in a building with a budget line. The question of what we owe to people with serious mental illness is one that American society has never fully answered, and the history of Thorazine is in large part a history of the consequences of not answering it. The drug made it possible to imagine a different relationship between serious mental illness and institutional care. What was done with that possibility reflects choices, political, fiscal, moral, that were made by people who had the power to make them differently. The hospitals closed. The community services were not built. The money that was supposed to follow the patients did not follow the patients. And the people who had been discharged to a community that was supposed to receive them were, in too many cases, simply no longer the state's immediate problem. This is not a story about evil intentions. The reformers who pushed for deinstitutionalization genuinely believed in what they were advocating. The politicians who cut hospital budgets faced real fiscal pressures and real competing demands. The physicians who prescribed Thorazine were offering their patients the best available treatment, and in many cases that treatment genuinely helped. The story of Thorazine and its aftermath is, if anything, a story about what happens when a genuine advance in one domain, pharmacology, is used to justify a policy change in another domain, institutional care, without the investments necessary to make that policy change work as described. What would it have looked like if deinstitutionalization had been done correctly? We have some evidence from the countries that did it better, some Western European nations that reduced institutional psychiatry, while simultaneously building robust community mental health infrastructure, including supported housing, assertive community treatment programs, and intensive case management that kept seriously ill people connected to medication and support regardless of their social circumstances. These systems cost money. They require sustained political commitment. They produce better outcomes by essentially any measure than what was built in the United States. They are not perfect. They are not utopian. They are simply better. The legacy of Thorazine 7 decades on is inseparable from the question of what a society decides to do with its most vulnerable members when it is no longer required to look at them every day. The drug emptied the asylums. It did not by itself build what was supposed to replace them. That work was left to communities, families and individuals who were given less than they needed and asked to do more than was reasonable. Some of them managed, many of them did not. And the people at the centre of the story, the patients themselves, the ones who took the drug, who left the hospitals, who navigated the gap between what was promised and what existed, deserve to have that part of the story told as clearly as the part about the drug that changed everything. Outro. And so, here we are. You've made it through the whole strange, sprawling, occasionally heartbreaking story of a little white pill that changed the world, or at least changed the world's relationship with the parts of itself it had spent centuries trying to lock away and forget about. Let's take a breath. A slow one. The kind medieval peasants apparently had to think about very carefully, though in your case the stakes are considerably lower, and there is no goat involved. Tonight you travelled somewhere most people never go, not to a castle, not to a battlefield, not to a pirate ship with a suspicious rash and no shoes. Tonight you went inside the history of the human mind. The long, uncomfortable, frequently disastrous, occasionally brilliant history of what happens when the most complex object in the known universe, the human brain, begins to work in ways that the world around it cannot recognise or accommodate, and you sat with that history for a while, which takes a certain kind of courage, even half asleep. Here is what you know now that you did not know 2 hours ago. You know that for most of human history, people experiencing what we would now call serious mental illness were understood through whatever explanatory framework the surrounding culture had available. Gods, demons, humours, moral failure, spiritual corruption, and treated accordingly. Which is to say, badly. Not always out of cruelty, often out of genuine ignorance, genuine fear, and the very human tendency to manage what you cannot understand by putting it somewhere you do not have to look at it. You know that the asylums that replaced those earlier arrangements were built on genuine idealism and collapsed, almost universally, under the weight of underfunding, overcrowding, and the gap between good intentions and institutional reality. You know that the state hospital system in America housed 500,000 people in conditions that most of the people who worked in it knew were indefensible, and that the thing holding the system in place was not malice but the complete absence of anything better. You know that Henri Laborie, a French naval surgeon with too many ideas and not enough colleagues willing to listen to all of them, noticed something in a surgical ward in the early 1950s that changed the entire story. That a compound sent to him by a pharmaceutical company as part of his search for something that would help surgical patients stop dying of shock did something to the human nervous system that no drug had ever done before. It did not put people to sleep. It did not knock them out. It made them calm, awake, present, and calm, in a way that pointed towards something the psychiatric world had been unable to imagine for centuries. The possibility that the worst symptoms of serious mental illness could be reduced by a chemical agent that a physician could prescribe and a patient could swallow. You know that Thorazine arrived on the wards of American psychiatric hospitals in 1954, and that the people who witnessed what it did, nurses, physicians, ward staff who had spent careers managing human suffering with restraints and prayers and very little else, described it in terms that are hard to read without feeling something. The silence that fell on wards that had never been silent. The patients who came back. The conversations that happened where conversations had not been possible. Something real changed, in those wards, in those months, in ways that the people experiencing it did not have adequate language for and did not entirely need. You know that the story did not end there, that the drug was used to justify a policy, deinstitutionalization, that was right in principle and catastrophically wrong in execution, that the hospitals closed faster than the communities were built to receive the people leaving them, that the money that was supposed to follow the patients did not follow the patients, that the people who had been inside those institutions, many of them having spent years or decades in them, were discharged into communities that were not prepared for them, with prescriptions that they could not always fill, for housing that did not always exist, toward support systems that had never been created. You know what happened next. You have seen it, even if you did not know what you were seeing. The person on the corner, the man shouting at something no one else can see, the woman in the shelter who is clearly somewhere else, in some internal landscape that the people around her cannot reach. These are not strangers who chose this. These are, in too many cases, the inheritors of a policy failure that happened before they were adults. A promise that was made and not kept, an infrastructure that was authorized and not built, a system that reformed itself on paper and then handed the bill to the people who could least afford to pay it. You know that the drug itself, the pill, the chlorpromazine molecule, the thing Henri Laborit noticed in a surgery unit in 1952, was genuinely, importantly, unambiguously good for many people, that it reduced suffering that had previously been unreducible, that it returned people to themselves in ways that the medicine of the preceding century could not have approached, that it was not a cure, that it came with costs of its own, that it was used imperfectly and sometimes coercively, and that none of that erases what it did for the people it helped. These things are all true simultaneously. History does not often resolve into simpler shapes than that, and maybe that is the thing worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. That the story of Thorazine is not a story about a miracle or a catastrophe. It is a story about what humans do when they get something right, when the science moves forward, when the knowledge accumulates, when someone notices something in a ward or a lab that points toward a better way, and then have to decide collectively whether to follow that knowledge all the way to its implications, or to follow it only as far as it is convenient and then stop. The science followed through. The drug worked. The dopamine hypothesis was right enough to be useful. The pharmacologists kept refining, kept developing, kept asking what else was possible. The researchers kept studying. The clinicians kept learning. That part of the story, the part that happens in labs and trials and journal articles and ward rounds, kept moving forward with something approaching integrity. The policy did not always follow through. The funding did not always follow through. The political will to build what was needed and keep it funded and staff it adequately and treat the people who needed it as though they were citizens whose welfare was the community's genuine concern. That part was fitful, inconsistent, and in too many places simply absent. And the people who lived in the gap between what the science made possible and what the policy actually built, they are still there. They're in the shelters and the jails and the emergency rooms and the streets of every major city in this country, and they are also in apartments and group homes and outpatient clinics and family living rooms, managing their lives with varying degrees of support and varying degrees of success, in a system that has never quite decided how much they are worth spending on. They deserve better than that. They always have. And the history of Thorazine, which is also the history of what happened when we had a chance to do things differently and mostly chose not to, is worth knowing, because the choice is still being made. Not in 1954, not in 1963, now, in budget negotiations and hospital board meetings and legislative sessions that decide whether the shelter opens or closes, whether the outpatient clinic stays funded, whether the person in crisis gets a treatment team or a police response. The pill was not the answer. It was the beginning of an answer, handed to a society that had to decide what to do with it. And what we did with it is a history we are still living in. So tonight, as you settle into whatever warmth and quiet you have arranged for yourself, your bed, your blanket, your fan, your reliable indoor temperature, let yourself feel for just a moment the weight of the story you have just been told, not with guilt, not with despair, with the particular kind of awareness that comes from knowing something real about where you are in time and who else was here before you and what they were carrying. The people in those wards in 1954, the people who left the hospitals in the 1970s, the researchers who spent their careers trying to understand a brain that still has not been fully understood, the families who provided care that no one trained them to provide, the patients who took the drug and felt it working, or felt it not working, or felt it working in ways they had not been warned about and had not consented to. All of them are part of the history of one pill, one molecule, one discovery in a French naval surgery unit that the world was not quite ready for. They were here. They mattered. Their story deserves to be told with the same care we bring to any history of human endurance, which is exactly what this is. Sleep well. You have earned it. And somewhere, in a ward or a shelter or an apartment or a street, someone who is carrying far more than you are tonight is making it through another hour. That is worth knowing. That is worth holding gently as you close your eyes. Good night.